Lieutenant Sarah Chun never imagined that her world would shatter on a Tuesday morning in Afghanistan. The explosion happened so fast that she barely had time to register the whistling sound of incoming mortar fire before the communications bunker erupted around her. When the dust settled and the ringing in her ears finally stopped, she found herself trapped under a collapsed beam with her left leg crushed and bleeding. The forward operating base had been under siege for 3 days. Taliban fighters had surrounded their position in the remote mountains of Helmand province, cutting off all supply lines and communication with headquarters. Sarah's job as the base's senior communications officer had become increasingly critical as the situation deteriorated. Every message she transmitted could mean the difference between life and death for the 200 soldiers stationed at the outpost. As medics worked frantically to free her from the debris, Sarah watched helplessly as sparks flew from the damaged radio equipment around her. The main communication array was destroyed, and the backup systems were failing one by one. Without reliable contact with command, they were essentially blind and deaf in hostile territory. The SEAL team that had arrived 2 days earlier for a classified extraction mission was now trapped alongside the regular Army units, their carefully planned operation in ruins. Captain Marcus Rodriguez, the SEAL team leader, found Sarah in the makeshift medical tent an hour after the attack. Her leg was badly mangled, held together by emergency splints and field dressings, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She was hunched over a partially damaged radio unit, her fingers moving expertly across the controls despite the obvious pain she was enduring. "Ma'am, you need to rest," Marcus said quietly, his weathered face creased with concern. "The docs say you've lost a lot of blood." Sarah looked up at him, sweat beading on her forehead. "Captain, with respect, I can rest when we're all home safe. This equipment is our only lifeline, and I'm the only one here who knows how to jury-rig these older systems." She gestured toward the damaged radio with a grimace. "The newer techs only know digital systems, but this Soviet-era equipment requires analog knowledge that most people don't have anymore." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The base's high-tech communication systems had been destroyed, leaving them dependent on decades-old backup equipment that most modern soldiers couldn't operate effectively. Sarah's unusual expertise with vintage radio systems, gained from years of studying old military manuals and tinkering with antique equipment as a hobby, had suddenly become invaluable. Marcus crouched beside her makeshift workspace. "What's our situation?" "Honestly, it's bad," Sarah replied, not sugarcoating the reality. "The main satellite uplink is completely fried. The microwave relay tower took a direct hit. We've got maybe 6 hours of battery power left for the emergency systems, and after that, we're operating on generators that are running low on fuel." She paused to adjust a connection, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through her injured leg. "But I think I can get us short-range communication with the valley outposts. Maybe even bounce a signal off the atmospheric layer if conditions are right." What Sarah didn't mention was that every movement sent waves of agony through her body. The field medic had given her morphine, but she'd refused additional doses because she needed her mind clear to work. The pain was so intense that she frequently had to stop working to prevent herself from passing out. But she kept pushing forward because she knew that failure meant death for everyone on the base. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked methodically through the damaged equipment. She cannibalized parts from destroyed radios, rewired circuits by hand, and improvised solutions using whatever materials she could find. Her engineering background, combined with her deep knowledge of radio frequency theory, allowed her to see possibilities that others missed. She turned broken antennas into improvised signal boosters and used damaged circuit boards as spare parts for more critical systems. The SEAL team watched in amazement as she gradually brought the communication systems back online. These were elite soldiers trained for the most dangerous missions, but they recognized exceptional skill when they saw it. Sarah's technical expertise was allowing them to regain contact with the outside world, which was essential for coordinating their escape from the surrounded outpost. "There," Sarah said finally, her voice hoarse from hours of concentrated effort. "I've got a weak signal to forward operating base Chapman. It's not much, but it should be enough to get a message through." She looked up at Marcus, her face pale but determined. What do you need to tell them? Marcus immediately began coordinating with his team and the base commander. The message they sent was brief, but crucial. Their position was compromised, they needed immediate extraction, and they had wounded personnel who required urgent medical attention. The response came back within minutes. A rescue operation was being planned, but it would take at least 12 hours to organize and execute. 12 hours might as well have been 12 days. The enemy forces surrounding the base had been probing their defenses continuously, testing for weak points. Ammunition was running low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and morale was beginning to crack under the constant pressure. Several soldiers had already been wounded in the ongoing skirmishes, and everyone knew that a full assault was coming soon. As night fell, the Taliban fighters began their major offensive. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded against the base's perimeter walls while automatic weapon fire raked across the compound. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of coordinating defensive communications while simultaneously trying to maintain contact with the incoming rescue force. Every few minutes, she had to relay position updates, casualty reports, and tactical information between different units while enemy bullets whined overhead. The communication bunker where she was working offered little protection. Sandbags had been hastily stacked around the equipment, but the position was exposed and dangerous. Several times during the night, Sarah had to throw herself to the ground as enemy fire concentrated on their location. The Taliban fighters had apparently figured out that disrupting communications would cripple the American defense, making the bunker a high-priority target. Despite the chaos around her, Sarah maintained her focus on the radio equipment. She made constant adjustments to account for atmospheric interference, equipment damage, and power fluctuations. When a stray bullet damaged one of her improvised antennas, she crawled outside under fire to repair it, dragging her injured leg behind her. The pain was excruciating, but she knew that losing communication capability would doom everyone on the base. Around midnight, Sarah managed to establish clearer contact with the rescue helicopters that were approaching their position. The pilots needed precise landing coordinates and real-time updates on enemy positions to avoid being shot down during their approach. Sarah became the critical link between the trapped soldiers and their salvation, guiding the rescue aircraft through a maze of hostile fire and dangerous terrain. The helicopters came in low and fast, their rotors churning up massive clouds of dust that reduced visibility to almost zero. Sarah maintained constant radio contact with the pilots, helping them navigate the treacherous landing zone while enemy tracer rounds streaked through the darkness around them. The evacuation would have to be quick and precise. The aircraft were sitting ducks while they were on the ground. As the first helicopter touched down, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. The communication systems she had rebuilt from scrap and spare parts had held together long enough to save lives. The SEAL team and the other wounded soldiers would make it out alive because she had refused to give up when everything seemed hopeless. But even as the evacuation began, Sarah knew her work wasn't finished. There were still soldiers who needed to be evacuated, and the communication systems had to remain operational until the last person was safely aboard the rescue aircraft. She continued working at her makeshift radio station, coordinating the complex logistics of extracting dozens of personnel from a combat zone while under heavy enemy fire. The first phase of the evacuation went smoothly, but Sarah could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather in the Afghan mountains could change rapidly, and she knew that deteriorating conditions could force the rescue helicopters to abort their mission. If that happened, everyone remaining on the base would be trapped until the weather cleared, giving the enemy more time to organize a devastating final assault. Sarah's injured leg had begun bleeding again from the constant movement and stress. The pain medication had long since worn off, and she was operating on pure determination and adrenaline. But she continued monitoring weather reports, atmospheric conditions, and enemy radio chatter, gathering every piece of information that might help the rescue operation succeed. As the second helicopter prepared for landing, Sarah intercepted enemy communications indicating that reinforcements were moving toward the base. The Taliban fighters were preparing a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the remaining defenders and capture or kill anyone who hadn't been evacuated yet. The rescue operation was about to become even more dangerous, and Sarah's communication skills would be more critical than ever in the hours ahead. The second helicopter touched down just as Sarah intercepted the most terrifying piece of intelligence yet. Through her monitoring of enemy radio frequencies, she discovered that a large Taliban force was moving into position for a final assault. They had heavy weapons, including mortars and rocket-propelled grenades, and they planned to attack just after dawn when visibility improved, but before additional rescue aircraft could arrive. Captain Rodriguez rushed to Sarah's position when she called for him urgently. "Captain, we've got maybe 4 hours before they hit us with everything they have," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious pain she was experiencing. "The enemy knows about the evacuation, and they're planning to time their attack to catch the helicopters on the ground." The situation had become a deadly race against time. There were still 47 people who needed to be evacuated, including several critically wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved easily. The rescue helicopters could only carry a limited number of passengers per trip, and each landing exposed them to increasing danger as the enemy tightened their grip around the base. Sarah's role became even more critical as she coordinated between the incoming aircraft, the ground forces, and intelligence sources. She monitored multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, tracking enemy movements while guiding the rescue helicopters through increasingly dangerous airspace. Her makeshift communication center had become the nerve center for the entire evacuation operation. What made Sarah's situation even more remarkable was that she was essentially operating a complex military communication network while suffering from severe injuries and blood loss. The field medics had repeatedly urged her to accept evacuation on one of the earlier helicopters, but she had refused because she knew that no one else on the base had her combination of technical knowledge and experience with the improvised equipment she had created. The third helicopter evacuation went smoothly, but Sarah noticed that the atmospheric conditions were beginning to deteriorate. Radio signals that had been clear earlier in the night were now suffering from interference, and weather reports indicated that a major storm system was approaching from the west. If the storm arrived before the evacuation was complete, the rescue helicopters would be forced to abort their mission, leaving the remaining personnel trapped in an impossible situation. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. While scanning enemy frequencies, she picked up communications indicating that the Taliban forces were receiving guidance from a sophisticated command post located several miles away. The enemy commanders were using modern radio equipment to coordinate the attacks, and Sarah realized that she might be able to disrupt their communications if she could modify her equipment to jam their signals. The technical challenge was enormous. Sarah would need to reconfigure her improvised radio systems to function as jammers while simultaneously maintaining communication with the rescue aircraft. It would require her to essentially build new equipment from scratch using damaged components and spare parts, all while working under enemy fire and dealing with her painful injuries. Working frantically, Sarah began modifying circuits and rewiring connections. She cannibalized components from radios that were beyond repair, using their transmitter circuits to create interference generators. The work required incredible precision because a single mistake could destroy the communication systems that were keeping the evacuation operation running. Captain Rodriguez and his SEAL team provided security for Sarah's position while she worked. They had originally been assigned to a completely different mission, but circumstances had forced them to adapt their plans. Now they found themselves defending a wounded communications officer whose technical skills had become essential for everyone's survival. As Sarah worked on the jamming equipment, enemy mortar rounds began falling closer to their position. The Taliban fighters had apparently identified the communication bunker as a critical target, and they were systematically trying to destroy it with indirect fire. Several mortar rounds landed within 50 meters of Sarah's workspace, showering the area with dirt and shrapnel. Despite the danger, Sarah continued working methodically through the modifications. Her engineering background allowed her to visualize complex circuit designs in her head, making the necessary changes even under extreme stress. She was essentially performing advanced electronics engineering in a combat zone while wounded and exhausted, using nothing but basic tools and salvage parts. When the fourth helicopter arrived, Sarah had completed the first phase of her jamming system. She activated the equipment and immediately noticed a reduction in enemy radio chatter. The Taliban commanders were having difficulty coordinating their forces because their communications were being disrupted by Sarah's improvised jammers. The effectiveness of the enemy attacks decreased noticeably as their ability to communicate was compromised. However, the jamming system came with a significant cost. The additional power requirements were draining the base's remaining battery reserves much faster than anticipated. Sarah calculated that they had perhaps 2 hours of power remaining before the entire communication system would shut down. After that, they would be completely cut off from the outside world, with no way to coordinate further evacuations or call for help. The race against time intensified as Sarah tried to balance power consumption with communication requirements. She had to constantly adjust the jamming system to maximize its effectiveness against enemy communications while preserving enough power to maintain contact with the rescue helicopters. It was like performing surgery on a patient while the operating room was under attack. Around 4:30 in the morning, disaster struck. A lucky enemy mortar round landed directly on the base's main generator, destroying their primary source of backup power. The explosion knocked Sarah unconscious for several minutes, and, when she regained consciousness, she found that most of her carefully constructed communication systems had been damaged or destroyed by the blast. With less than 2 hours until the predicted enemy assault, Sarah found herself starting almost from scratch. The battery-powered systems that remained functional would last perhaps 30 minutes under normal conditions, but the jamming equipment was consuming power at an accelerated rate. She had to make an impossible choice: maintain communications with the rescue aircraft or continue jamming enemy communications, but not both. Sarah chose to prioritize the rescue communications, shutting down the jamming system to conserve power. Almost immediately, enemy radio chatter resumed as the Taliban commanders regained the ability to coordinate their forces. The next helicopter would be flying into a much more dangerous situation, but without communication capabilities, the rescue operation would fail completely. As she worked desperately to rebuild the damaged systems, Sarah began to realize just how precarious their situation had become. The storm clouds on the horizon were moving closer, bringing weather conditions that would ground the helicopters. The enemy was massing for a major assault that would begin shortly after dawn. The base's defenses were weakening as ammunition ran low and exhausted soldiers struggled to maintain their positions. But, perhaps most critically, Sarah's own physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of blood loss, exhaustion, and constant stress was taking a severe toll. She was having difficulty maintaining focus, and her hands were beginning to shake from weakness and pain. The field medic had warned her that she needed immediate surgery to save her leg, but she continued postponing medical treatment because the communication systems required constant attention. The 5th helicopter managed to evacuate another load of personnel, but the pilot reported that enemy fire was becoming much more accurate and coordinated. The Taliban forces were regaining their ability to conduct organized attacks as their communications improved. Sarah knew that the jamming system needed to be reactivated, but doing so would drain the remaining battery power in minutes rather than hours. As dawn approached, Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her military career. 23 people remained on the base, including herself and the SEAL team that had stayed behind to provide security. The final evacuation helicopters were preparing to launch, but they would be flying into a storm of enemy fire coordinated by commanders who were no longer being jammed. Sarah looked at the jury-rigged equipment around her, calculating power consumption and signal strength in her head. She had perhaps 15 minutes of full communication capability remaining, or she could stretch the power to last 30 minutes by reducing transmission strength and accepting weaker signals. Either choice carried enormous risks for everyone involved. The sound of enemy mortars falling in the distance told her that the final assault was beginning. Sarah's communication systems would need to guide the last helicopters through the most dangerous landing of the entire operation, coordinating defensive fires and managing the evacuation under combat conditions. Everything depended on the choices she made in the next few critical minutes. Sarah made her choice. She would use every remaining minute of power to ensure the final evacuation succeeded, even if it meant sacrificing her own chance of rescue. She reconfigured the communication systems one last time, channeling all available power into maximum transmission strength for the critical final phase of the operation. The morning assault began exactly as enemy communications had indicated. Mortar rounds and rocket-propelled grenades hammered the base's perimeter while machine gun fire swept across the compound. The Taliban fighters had coordinated their attack perfectly, hitting multiple positions simultaneously to overwhelm the remaining defenders. Sarah found herself in the middle of the most intense combat she had ever experienced. Through it all, she maintained constant radio contact with the incoming rescue helicopters. The pilots needed precise guidance to navigate through the storm of enemy fire, and Sarah provided real-time updates on safe approach routes and landing zones. Her voice remained steady and professional even as explosions shook the ground around her communication bunker. Captain Rodriguez and his SEAL team fought desperately to hold the defensive perimeter while the final evacuations took place. These elite warriors were vastly outnumbered, but they used their superior training and equipment to maximum advantage. They coordinated their defensive fires through Sarah's communication network, turning her bunker into a tactical command center for the entire battle. The 6th helicopter approached through heavy enemy fire, its pilot guided by Sarah's precise instructions. She had calculated the safest approach route by monitoring enemy positions and weapon capabilities, threading the aircraft between concentrations of hostile forces. The helicopter took multiple hits during its approach, but the pilot managed to land safely in the designated zone. As wounded personnel were loaded aboard the aircraft, Sarah realized that the communication systems were beginning to fail. The improvised power connections she had created were burning out under the heavy load, and several critical circuits were showing signs of imminent failure. She had perhaps 10 minutes of reliable communication remaining before everything shut down completely. The 7th helicopter was the most dangerous landing yet. Enemy forces had identified the landing zone and were concentrating their fire on the area. Sarah guided the pilot through a complex approach that used terrain features to provide cover from hostile weapons, but the aircraft still took heavy damage during its descent. The pilot reported that his helicopter was barely flyable and that this would likely be his last trip. With 12 people still remaining on the base, including herself and the SEAL team, Sarah faced an impossible calculation. The damaged helicopter could carry perhaps 8 passengers safely, meaning that several people would have to remain behind. As the senior communications officer, she was essential for coordinating any future rescue attempts, but her injuries were so severe that she might not survive another few hours without proper medical treatment. Captain Rodriguez made the decision for her. "Ma'am, you're going on this helicopter," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the sound of gunfire. "We can hold this position until another aircraft arrives, but if you don't get medical attention soon, you're not going to make it." Sarah shook her head stubbornly. "Captain, without communications, you'll be completely isolated. The storm is moving in, which means no more helicopters for at least 6 hours. You need me to maintain contact with command and coordinate defensive fires." She gestured toward the failing radio equipment. "This system will shut down completely in a few minutes unless someone who understands it keeps it running." What followed was perhaps the most difficult conversation of both their military careers. Marcus knew that Sarah was right about the communication requirements, but he also knew that she was dying slowly from her injuries and blood loss. The field medic had privately told him that Sarah needed surgery within hours or she would lose her leg and possibly her life. Sarah had already made her choice. She began teaching Marcus the basics of operating the improvised communication systems, showing him which connections were critical and which backup procedures to follow when equipment failed. It was a crash course in military communications engineering delivered under combat conditions, with explosions punctuating every sentence. The 8th helicopter evacuation proceeded successfully, taking 8 more personnel to safety. But as the aircraft departed, Sarah's communication systems finally began shutting down from power exhaustion. The screens flickered and went dark one by one, leaving only a single battery-powered radio with perhaps 5 minutes of operation remaining. In those final minutes of communication capability, Sarah coordinated one last critical mission. She had been monitoring weather reports throughout the night, and She knew that the approaching storm would create a brief window of opportunity. The heavy cloud cover would provide concealment for aircraft, but it would also make navigation extremely dangerous for pilots who weren't familiar with the mountainous terrain. Sarah used her last minutes of radio contact to transmit detailed navigation data to the rescue aircraft waiting at the staging area. She provided GPS coordinates, terrain features, and safe approach routes that would allow pilots to reach the base even in poor visibility conditions. Her final transmission included critical information about enemy positions and defensive capabilities that would help future rescue attempts succeed. When the radio finally went silent, Sarah found herself in an eerie quiet broken only by distant gunfire. The communication systems that had connected them to the outside world were dead, and she was now completely isolated with Captain Rodriguez and 3 other SEAL team members who had volunteered to remain behind. They had enough ammunition for perhaps 2 hours of sustained combat, after which they would be overrun by superior enemy forces. But Sarah wasn't finished fighting. Even without powered radio equipment, she still had one final option available. During her years of studying vintage military communications, she had learned about emergency signaling techniques that didn't require electrical power. Using mirrors, fires, and other improvised methods, it was possible to send messages across long distances to anyone who knew what to look for. Working with materials scavenged from around the base, Sarah began constructing a series of signal mirrors and smoke generators. The approaching storm clouds would actually help by providing a dark background against which light signals would be visible from aircraft. She positioned the signaling equipment at multiple locations around the compound, creating a network that could be operated by the remaining team members. The final phase of the rescue operation unfolded like a deadly chess match. Sarah and the SEAL team used their signaling system to guide rescue helicopters through the storm, communicating through flashes of reflected sunlight and patterns of smoke. The pilots had to navigate by visual signals alone, flying through dangerous mountain valleys while enemy forces tried to shoot them down. The 9th helicopter approached through the storm just as Sarah had predicted, its pilot following the light signals she had positioned throughout the valley. The aircraft was barely visible through the clouds and rain, but the signaling system allowed for precise communication even without radio contact. Sarah coordinated the final landing using nothing but mirrors and predetermined signal codes. As the last helicopter touched down, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge the full extent of her injuries. The adrenaline that had sustained her throughout the night was wearing off, and waves of pain were washing over her. The field medic who rushed to her position took one look at her condition and immediately began preparing for emergency treatment. Loading Sarah onto the helicopter required careful handling because of her mangled leg. The SEAL team members worked gently but quickly, knowing that every second on the ground increased their danger from enemy fire. Sarah remained conscious throughout the evacuation, still trying to provide information about enemy positions and tactical situations even as medical personnel worked to stabilize her condition. The helicopter lifted off just as enemy forces overran the base's outer perimeter. If the evacuation had been delayed by even a few more minutes, everyone remaining would have been killed or captured. Sarah's communication expertise and determination had made the difference between success and disaster, saving the lives of dozens of American soldiers and elite special operations personnel. During the flight to the medical facility, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as doctors worked to control her bleeding and stabilize her injuries. When she was finally lucid enough to speak, her first question was about the other personnel who had been evacuated. She wanted to know that everyone had made it out safely before she allowed herself to focus on her own recovery. The surgery to save Sarah's leg took 8 hours and required multiple procedures. The doctors managed to preserve the limb, but she faced months of rehabilitation and physical therapy. Her military career was effectively over, but she had achieved something far more important than personal advancement. She had proven that courage and technical expertise could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Captain Rodriguez visited Sarah during her recovery and presented her with a medal that had been personally approved by the commanding general. But, more importantly, he brought letters from every person who had been evacuated from the base. Each letter described how Sarah's refusal to give up had saved their life, and how her example of determination under pressure had inspired them to become better soldiers. Sarah's story became legendary within military communications circles. Her techniques for improvising radio equipment under combat conditions were studied and incorporated into training programs. The jamming methods she developed were analyzed by military engineers and became part of standard electronic warfare doctrine. Most importantly, her example of technical excellence and personal courage became a model for future communications officers. The base in Afghanistan was eventually abandoned, but satellite imagery showed that Sarah's improvised antenna installations remained standing for months afterward. The equipment she had built from spare parts and salvage materials had been constructed so well that it continued functioning long after the last American forces had departed. It was a lasting testament to the skill and determination of one wounded communications officer who refused to let her fellow soldiers down when everything was falling apart. Years later, Sarah would speak to military academies and technical schools about the importance of fundamental engineering knowledge and improvisation skills. She emphasized that while modern equipment was sophisticated and capable, soldiers needed to understand basic principles well enough to build solutions from nothing when sophisticated systems failed. Her legacy lived on in the countless communications specialists who learned to see possibilities where others saw only broken equipment and impossible odds.